Okay, so a couple times now you've asked me to talk this subject, and I can do that. It's a bit complicated. It's kind of a technical subject, which is the question of why you would or would not want nuclear power as we go into an era of climate change. I'm trying to make sure my input is working. Yes, it is. Okay. So, in a nutshell, what's been happening is that as the world's dependency on fossil fuels has led to increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, scientists have been ringing an alarm bell that we must reduce our emissions of CO2. Now, what that really translates into is we have to cut our consumption of fossil fuels. So there's no reducing CO2 emissions unless you just don't burn the fuels. So when you allow that penny to drop, it's like, oh, we have to stop burning fossil fuels. Okay, interesting. Then you have to start looking at alternative fuels. And that's kind of the term used to describe these other fuels that you can use for generating electricity or maybe possibly powering cars and trucks and planes. So there's a bunch of plant-based fuels, biofuels that you can use to make diesel. You can burn wood chips at power plants to do those kinds of things. But these all have really, really serious limitations. This is not going to power your global economy. In terms of generating electricity, you get renewable electricity from things like hydropower, from wind and solar and tidal and some other things. The hydropower is the most explored, and in fact, most of the available places where you can build dams, raise reservoirs, and get, harvest the potential energy from the height of the dam have been taken. All right, hydropower was an obvious thing. Building dams is cheap; they'll last a long time, 60 or 100 years, and the electricity is essentially free once you built the dam. Plus, you get a nice reservoir for recreational activity. So, we've been building dams all over the North America, and you need a river, and that river needs to be near places where you can build with canyons and whatnot where you can build a dam. So at this point, we've pretty much explored all the alternatives to fossil fuels to generate either fuel for transportation or electricity. And when we started making noise about, well, we have to, cut back on fossil fuel emissions, and people are saying, well, then how are we going to generate electricity? Because we've kind of already explored the low-hanging fruit. We picked the low-hanging fruit for generating electricity. We need a lot of electricity, and we need transportation. So what are we going to do? And many people came up and said, well, we could take another look at nuclear, right? There's a lot of nuclear fuels in the earth. We could mine those, concentrate those, put those in these power plants, and they'll run for 10, 20 years on one charge of fuel, and then you have to recharge them, but at least it's not carbon based. So in the 70s we were exploring a lot of nuclear, and then there started to be problems. Here in the US we had I think it's Hanford Reservation had a nuclear meltdown. And a lot of these were experimental nuclear facilities, but it doesn't matter. They had
Chernobyl
problems.
you were looking at
And then of course we had 3 Mile Island, TMI, and a couple of others.
Chernobyl.
But there's still a lot of nuclear plants running in the United States, but we stopped building them. After 3 Mile Island, we just stopped building them.
That was a meltdown.
And there was no exploration, at least in this country that I'm aware of other ways of building nuclear plants. We just stopped doing it. Now, the fossil fuel industry was really, really thrilled that America stopped exploring nuclear power. The coal industry, big coal, big oil, big natural gas, they were all over that. And there's a lot of even conspiracy theories that a big part of the anti-nuclear movement in America was created sort of like greenwashing. It was created by the fossil fuel industry. And I don't even doubt that that's true. That's probably exactly what happened. But in any case, there were real fears, and we stopped developing nuclear power. Then There were other disasters all around the world, really, with nuclear power, and people just became solidified in their position. After Chernobyl and after there was a whole bunch of countries that decommissioned nuclear plants, and then after Fukushima, there was a whole other wave.
Germany
that decommissioned even more plants. France still has a lot of them. I don't think Russia does. They had some, other than Chernobyl. I think they still have a few. But, you know, nuclear power, you know, it's still a big deal, but it's obviously, you know, it had its problems. Now, people will come along and they'll tell you, oh, well, those were older plants. The Fukushima plant was, you know, built in the 80s, and they were older technology. We've now done a lot of research and development in nuclear. We have better technology. And that could be true. I mean, maybe we did R&D. Maybe there's better things. Maybe people looked at it. That could all be true. But anyway, the nations of the world know these things, what's capable, what's available in technology, and they're not building them. Okay, so the world, much of the world is not going this direction. And yet, we're going to now have to very quickly wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, leave that stuff in the ground, and find some other way to make electricity. And people who say, you know, point out correctly, you know, that wind is unreliable, and solar is, of course, only available during the daytime at best, and not so much even in the winter. And you know, they point that out. And they say, well, we should go nuclear. So now there's talk, and some of this talk is coming from the people who have accepted climate change as reality, that the fossil fuels are the problem. We have to get ourselves off of fossil fuels in a big way, really fast. And so these are people who would be considered environmentally conscious, and yet they're coming out and saying nuclear. So what about nuclear?
I just want to say one thing, because one of your prepositions or prefaces to this was saying we need lots of electricity. And I wanted to take that on as a critical spot in this dialogue, because how much electricity we need is really dependent on how we live our lives. And so I think a very important part of it is the foundation of reducing our demand for electricity, so we don't have as much of a demand for like things like nuclear going forward. And I think that has to be one of the foundations of how we're building our society, is that now we're being tempted to the siren song of nuclear because it's non-carbon, and saying, oh, well, now we need so much electricity. That type of you know, foundation of we need so much electricity, we have to really, you know, bring that down so that we don't have to make these compromises to go towards nuclear. And Kat will talk about the problems with the compromises.
So that's the solution. Are we done discussing it now?
Is want to reduce our demand for electricity has to be a foundation of our going forward. So that was it.
All right. So that's all we had to say. Reduce your electricity demand, and we won't need to go with nuclear.
No, go forward with why not nuclear is why, you know, to say, yes, you know, that's where I'm talking about the electric car. Is we have to demands for an electric car, then we have so much demand for electricity that the nuclear is more attractive to us. But so I'm trying to put that in to preface it, that we have to reduce our demand so we don't have to be drawn into the problems of nuclear that Kat was going to describe.
So I don't need to describe the problems. Okay. I don't even want to necessarily make this video. Okay. Because these are things that it doesn't matter what anyone says. It doesn't matter what you just said. These are things that are now going to happen.
What, we're going to go for nuclear?
Yes.
I was hoping you'd talk about why we shouldn't be.
Okay, I can say that, but it doesn't even matter why I say we shouldn't. That's what they're going to do. They're going to have to do this, because everything you just said is not correct.
Okay. All right. Well, then it's over. We can say goodbye. Is basically you're saying that there's nothing you want to say. I thought you were going to talk about why we shouldn't choose nuclear, you know, as a, you know.
Okay, that's actually not how I operate. You've consistently failed to notice that I don't operate that way. I'm not going to tell people what to do.
Okay.
I'm not going to tell them why you should or should not do anything. What I'm going to tell people is, if you choose this route, this is what's going to happen to you.
Okay, so tell us about the route of nuclear.
Okay. Now, They are going to choose nuclear. They're going to do this because people are selfish and greedy. They don't want to have to put
Any
solar panels
restrictions?
on their house. They don't want to have to pay more for electricity. They don't want to drive an electric car. They don't want to do anything. They just want business as usual now, all the time, 24/7. Oh, and I want 4 trips to Disneyland every year. Okay.
And they do want an electric car. They want that. You know, they're not going to say,
No, they want someone else to have an electric car so they can have their fossil fuels. So someone else is conserving and they can have their fossil fuels. I'm just telling you how people think.
all right.
That's how people are. And it's going to be the same with nuclear. So if you ever tell people we're going to have to cut the use of natural gas for generating electricity, and we're going to have to cut the use of coal for the same purpose, the coal industry and the gas industry is going to come along and say, well, we're going to make it impossible for you to make that decision because we're going to go to the people in full-page glossy ads in every publication and tell them that you're taking away their electricity. They're going to make it so expensive they can't use it, and you're going to destroy their lives. So if you're going to do that, if you're going to say we can't have natural gas and we cannot have coal, then you have to come up with something else that will placate people. It's going to be nuclear. Now, a few years ago, I wouldn't have said something like that. I would have assumed that we've had so many problems with nuclear power, and there've been so many disasters, including the recent one in Japan, that there's no way people would go for that. But now, looking back, I realized, oh, they swept that Japan Fukushima thing under the rug. You haven't heard about that since basically the day it happened, right? Maybe a couple of weeks after. Chernobyl, it's completely swept under a rug. No one talks about these things anymore because they know that they can't make people frightened about nuclear power because they may have to do that. Now that the bigger problem is making the world uninhabitable by burning fossil fuels, they're looking back at the problem of the options of nuclear power. Now, if you go that way, if you say, yeah, sure, fine, do whatever you have to do, so long as my life isn't impacted, you do what you got to do. If you go that route, and you vote for those funds, and you vote for those programs, and you approve those programs, and you go that route, here's what's going to happen.
The nuclear route.
Here's what's going to happen. One, I don't even know that they're going to leave fossil fuels in the ground if they go nuclear. These are two completely different businesses. The nuclear industry will go nuclear, and they'll build power plants everywhere, and they'll be happy to do that. And then people will find new uses for the electricity. You know, they'll leave their lights on all throughout the house all night long. Okay, that whatever they want to do with the electricity, and this fossil fuel industry will still be there with their coal-fired power plants, generating even more. If you bring all these plants online, you're not going to get rid of the old ones. Is my point. You're going to leave them up, and you're going to have cheap electricity, and everyone's going to be happy. So you're probably not going to solve your problem with climate change because that's a whole nother industry, and they're not going to just roll over and die just because you gave the nuclear industry some money to build plants. The second thing that's going to happen is you are building something, a nuclear power plant that takes 20 years to build, 40 years to decommission, and then only runs for about 20 or 30 years before it has to be decommissioned. That plant requires very capable staff, people who go to school and learn nuclear physics, seriously, rocket science, okay, rocket surgery. They learn nuclear physics. They learn how to build these plants and operate these plants. There's very few people who can do this. Very few people want to do this, okay?
It's risky.
Yeah, it's risky. They understand the risks, and not everybody wants to do it. So now you got these things dotting the landscape. Then one day, whatever happens, our civilization collapses. Now, civilizations don't collapse over 100 years, giving you all the time you need to rejigger your cities and your urban areas.
Put away your rods, your nuclear rods.
You know, and decommission your nuclear power plants and rejigger your agriculture. You don't get 100 years to do these things, okay? I mean, actually, you might have 100 years of warnings, and right now we've had plenty of warnings about climate change.
Right,
it's going to end us, okay? But we're not heeding those warnings. So even if you got those warnings, you're not going to heed those warnings, and then suddenly, after 100 years of warnings, and you didn't do anything, it collapses. How does it collapse? Well, there's lots of ways that it collapses. I'll use my favorite example, and everyone's favorite example, the collapse of the Roman Empire. What happens is you get overextended. You keep going further and further to make ends meet. Like any household that's spending more money than they have income, you just keep going further and further. And maybe you surrender a couple of things. You don't do 4 trips to Disneyland a year. You only do 2. But mostly you don't surrender anything. You just keep going further and further. Okay, stretching yourself further and further. And then one day the rubber band breaks. You can't stretch it anymore. So that's how civilizations collapse. Rome was the same way. They kept invading countries, taking their loot, enslaving their people, going further and further and further. And then finally, they just became stretched so thin that they themselves were vulnerable to attack. And Rome was sacked in 472 AD, and that was the end of it. They were done. Boom, overnight, done. And maybe some people who were paying attention could have seen the end coming for 10 years or 20 years, but no one said anything. And then boom, one day they were done. Almost literally one day, almost literally overnight, they were done. And if you were dependent on the Roman Empire for anything, trade, protection, leadership, laws, anything at all, security, you didn't have those things anymore. Literally overnight.
Because that was really important. You're saying that the real one word that brought the Roman Empire down was overextension.
They were overextended.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's really
and it wasn't a random event like a meteor strike or a pandemic or something like that. They were overextended by virtue of necessity. They knew what they were doing. And when they collapsed, it was because they knew what they were doing and had to do it. They had to keep going further and further out to get more and more treasure and enslave more and more people just to keep their engine rolling over, okay? And we're in the same spot. So yes, we're going to go nuclear, but we'll keep the fossil fuels. And then we're going to keep doing. And then the world gets hotter. And then there's parts of the planet become uninhabitable. And then those people are on the move. And we have mass migrations of climate refugees. And they're overwhelming other countries. And those countries become destabilized. And then they can't grow their food. And then there's no food there either. And pretty soon there's millions of people, hundreds of million people all over the planet moving and trying to find food and eating everything in sight. And just rolling over borders. Like, who cares if there's a border here? I'm coming in. Do you have food? Feed me. I need food. I need water. I need medicine. My children need help. And they're just going to roll over your borders. And it could almost, you'll have warning. You'll have 10 years. You'll have 20 years of warning. The unrest will be there. It'll be stirring. People will be hungry. The UN will be saying we have problems. Right. And we're hearing this stuff already right now.
Over and over from the UN.
And you'll get some warning, but you won't get 100 years worth of warning. You'll get 5 years or 3 years.
We've been getting it.
So you roll all these nuclear power plants out, and you have your whole civilization dependent on these things, and you've got them everywhere, and then your civilization collapses. And overnight, essentially,
and the legacy
within a few
we
years,
leave to our
10 years maybe,
future generations is
so now you have all these power plants dotting your country, and now your country is collapsing. So these highly skilled, highly paid technicians, these are not construction workers, okay? These are people who have a lot of training to run these places. Do you really seriously think that they're going to get up in the morning, go out and get in their Chevy, drive the 35 miles to the nuclear plant, leave their families behind, and go out there, spend 45 minutes or an hour to get out there and work at the nuclear plant when all they say on the news is that borders are being overrun and food scarcity and
hurricanes and
mobs of people showing up wanting food and shelter as their own countries become uninhabitable due to the heat. And are you really going to go do that? Well, yeah, you'll do that for a while. You'll make that trip, and then the emergencies will get worse, and your spouse will become frightened, and your children want their parents nearby.
And there's no food, and there's no food.
Pretty soon, you're going to stop making that trip. Maybe some days you'll go in, but most of the time you have to stay home with your family.
Grow food.
Maybe you're growing food. Maybe you're defending your home from invaders. Maybe the first time you left, someone broke into the house and took all the food, terrified your spouse, and terrified your children, right? So you stop doing that. You stop going out to the nuclear power plant. Maybe go out there once in a while. Because, hey, if you don't go, this sucker could go down, right? But at some point, they stop going. Now, let's assume they all do the right thing. and they shut down the plant, right? Shut down the plant, put it in shutdown mode. Takes about a month to do that. It takes certainly weeks to do that safely. Okay, we don't break anything. And so you shut the thing down, put it in lockdown, and then I guess you could leave at that point if you wanted to, right? Except the fuel rods need to be maintained constantly. You have to have at least a crew there to make sure that the pumps are working, that the coolant is flowing, that the fuel rods are being managed. Plus, you've probably got several tanks of spent fuel rods on the property that are in cooling tanks, that the water has to be maintained at a certain level. There can't be any leaks. The pumps have to keep working. So this plant, even when it's shut down, is a 24/7 operation for somebody, right? Somebody has to be there. Well, what if there's nobody there? What if people just leave? And the companies that manage these plants, they don't need a plan B. Their only plan ever was plan A, which is build the plant, make the money, sell the electricity, and then let someone else worry about the externalities of shutting it down. Not my problem. I'll sell the plant to the government or some other, stove bolt company that we just made out of nothing, just for the purpose of shutting it down, and then we walk away with the profits. And then, if it gets shut down, that's fine. If it doesn't, that's okay too, because we're gone. All right, that's how they're going to do this. So now you have these plants all over the country because of climate change, the very thing that caused these things to be created. Because of climate change, civilization begins to collapse. Because you didn't stop climate change just by building nuclear power plants. What you did by nuclear power plants is you made it so that people could continue to drive and fly and move goods and Amazon Prime and all this stuff, and so they did.
80-inch TVs and
Yeah, so they just kept doing that, right? And meanwhile, we're probably still burning the fossil fuels, the crude oil certainly, to drive ourselves around and have our container ships with their containers from China and South Korea.
Large homes. Yeah,
big homes, and it takes fossil fuels just to make solar panels and windmills. So we just kept going and going and going. We never pulled back. We never retrenched. We just kept going, and we built nuclear power plants to make up for the things that the electricity we have to have. That maybe we stopped burning coal. Maybe we stopped burning some natural gas. And if you're going to play that deal, if that's going to be the deal, you're going to play that card, then you're going to be stuck with these things. Even if we see that civilization is on the rocks and we decommission these plants, we shut them down, and we really take the fuel rods out, we really store them in the fuel ponds.
With staff to monitor them.
Then they're going to have to be monitored for about 10,000 years. Okay? I mean, that was always there, people. That was always there.
They have to be staffed for 10,000 years. Managed.
When the Fukushima plant blew itself up, well, there's 4 of them. I think 3 of them blew themselves up. One of them had been decommissioned for months for maintenance, and they'd pull the fuel rods out, and they were sitting in ponds on site within the containment structure in ponds to be kept cool. And one of the concerns after the disaster was that they couldn't manage those fuel pools anymore, and they were worried that the water was going to boil out of them, and the fuel rods just sitting, not out of the reactor, sitting in a pond, would ignite, that they get hot, and the zirconium cladding that they're in would catch fire. And then they would have a massive nuclear release into the atmosphere, because these nuclear fuels, they're metals, and they burn in atmosphere. They burn in oxygen. So they would have a nuclear fuel fire. Iron burns in the presence of oxygen. That's how a cutting torch works. A cutting torch just supplies the heat. The actual burning of the iron as you're cutting it is combustion of the iron itself. It just gets so hot, it just burns, it catches fire. And one of the reasons the World Trade Center fell was because so much fuel had been dumped into the World Trade Center by the jet, which was full. It just taken off. That it got so hot that the iron caught fire and burned. The iron burned. So iron can burn, and nuclear fuels can burn as well. They burn with oxygen. They catch fire, and they just burn like wood, essentially.
So was the fuel from the airplane? Did that ignite? Did that just self-combust?
And ignited,
that metal?
It got so hot.
Melted the iron?
It got so hot that the iron was able to burn and melt.
The heat from the burning of the fuel? Right.
Yeah. They think that's what made it collapse.
Because the fuel was there and it ignited.
Yeah. And then the iron got so hot, it caught fire. And then that was the end of it.
Right.
So anyway, the scenario here is that our relationship with these nuclear power plants is a 100-year relationship.
At least, yeah.
20 years to build them, 20, 30 years to operate them, and then 30 or 40 years to decommission them.
Getting back to what you were saying with Fukushima and the one that they had
And then you're stuck with the fuel rods for
right.
thousands
The
of
one
years.
that they had decommissioned, you said of the three, one was decommissioned. What happened in that scenario? That it was
Nothing happened. It wasn't running.
right, but
So-
they had it in the ponds or
But
something.
the fuel rods were sitting out of the reactor core in ponds.
right. It have to be
I
covered
think
with
they were
water.
waiting to be put back in. There was
Uh-huh.
some kind of maintenance going on.
Yeah.
I'd have to look it up.
Yeah,
But they were not in the core. They were
Okay.
in the pond.
right,
But they were still a threat
right.
because in the ponds they have to be managed.
Okay, right.
And if they couldn't get in there to manage them because the whole site was a
Disaster.
nuclear accident,
Okay,
right? They were worried that those ponds were going to run out of water, that the water was going to boil out of those ponds. And the concern with the water was that there was
That
no
cools them,
electricity
that
to the
cools them.
site,
Right. Okay.
ironically enough. And so nothing was working.
Right.
No safety measures, no
Right.
pumps,
Uh-huh.
no alarms,
Right.
nothing was working.
Right.
And so they didn't have visibility into the state of those ponds. And their concern was
Right.
that they were, without the pumps running to circulate the water, the
Right.
cooling water,
Right.
that the ponds were going to boil dry,
Right.
just
Okay.
boil from the heat of the
and then
nuclear
you'd
fuel.
have a
Boil dry,
right.
and you'd have exposed fuel rods
Right.
exposed to air,
Right.
and they would catch fire
Oh.
and burn. You'd have burning
Nuclear.
nuclear fuel.
So
okay?
how did they prevent that? What happened? What did they have to do?
I think what they did was they brought in fire trucks, and they sprayed water into the containment structure, like over the top into it,
okay, right.
and they
yeah.
kept the ponds full as the water was boiling out.
But it was a
That's my
concern.
recollection.
Yeah, it was a big concern.
They were
Yeah.
concerned about it.
Right.
Okay, so that's their industry, not mine. Okay, they were the ones who were worried about that, not me. I
That's-
wasn't the one saying, "Oh my God, the spent nuclear fuel rods." They were worried about the
Right,
spent fuel
right.
rods. Okay, they were the ones saying, "Oh fuck, we got spent fuel rods, and we're not circulating the water. Someone needs to check on those because that could be really bad." They were saying that, not me. Okay,
And they had to bring in fire trucks and to make it work, and
Yeah.
you know, a lot of.
I think originally they were dropping water from helicopters or something
oh,
like that.
okay, yeah. So there had to be a lot of protocols of a functioning society to make
Yes,
that work.
and that's kind of the point of
And,
this. Is that if we suffer a societal collapse the way Rome did, where it happens like within a few years, a decade, less than a decade, 5 or 6 years.
is that how it was with Rome?
Yeah, pretty much. If we suffer that kind of a collapse because of climate change, then these people who operate these power plants, they're not going to be there. You can't ask them to be there all by themselves, surrounded by mobs of angry, hungry people,
And
right?
fire trucks and helicopters to coordinate to.
Everyone's going to leave,
Yeah.
including the corporations that built these places. You're just going to leave. They're going to disappear. They're going to declare bankruptcy. They're going to take the money, and the corporate executives are going to go to their private islands to wait out the end of the world.
And then
right?
what Kat was saying is that the problems of climate change, as they exacerbate, and we live in a living hell, is what I heard yesterday on the news. Is that what the Earth is going to turn into, a living hell? How are we going to manage the complexities of responding to a nuclear disaster with limited resources, where we're just trying to survive, floods and
Okay,
fires?
well, set aside the nuclear
and-
disaster.
Well, I'm just saying,
It's not the disaster.
compounded disaster
It's
of
actually
climate change stretching us thin.
Operating correctly, these things are not going to survive the collapse of civilization. Now, the collapse of civilization at this point, in my thinking, just looking at what's happening in the environment with people, nations and food supplies and the climate and the habitat, I think that societal collapse is inevitable at this point. I'm not the only one saying it. Lots of people are saying that. Lots of people are looking at that and saying, whoa, we're in big trouble. We have an entire global civilization that's dependent on fossil fuels, and fossil fuels can't go forward. Okay, we're fucked. Okay, I'm saying that. Lots of other people are saying that. And there's a lot of people saying it in private. They're making their plans. They're selling their real estate. They're buying their private boats and islands. They're voting with their feet. Okay, so
Oh, and then the last thing we just okay, go ahead. But it was even today we were talking about that COVID-19 is also bringing a collapse of capitalism.
Yeah, it
so
is.
That's another thing.
Who knew,
that's
right?
happening.
So even though this was kind of in the queue for climate change as well, the pandemic came along and just gave us a taste of what that's going to look like. This pandemic is getting worse by the day, and by worse, I don't mean it's spreading and more people are getting sick. The actual virus itself is getting worse.
Right.
This was actually expected. This was anticipated. It's learning tricks. Okay. I don't want to get off topic, although I guess I'm almost done with this topic.
That's okay.
But I do want to say that the pandemic, which was something we could have easily controlled,
by shutting down capitalism.
Easily. Okay. Just people go home, stay home for 6 weeks. We'll pay your bills for a little while.
Right.
We'll send food around. You'll be okay, and we'll just nip this in the bud. That's how they could have. That's how they could have handled it
for the people.
They didn't do it because they couldn't. Okay, they didn't do it because they couldn't, and I understand now that they couldn't do that.
And to keep the businesses going.
Yeah.
And that was the wrong choice.
Now in China, they did it because they have a command economy, and if you don't do things the way the Central Committee wants you to do things, they shoot you, kill you. Okay, so but we don't do that here in America or in Europe or in the UK in the West. We don't do things that way, and most civilized countries don't do things that way. So we couldn't do it. Okay, we could have easily nipped this in the bud, and we didn't do it because we couldn't do it. Now, the lesson we learned from that is that something as small as this that we could have easily managed just about destroyed Western industrialized capitalism. I never thought I would see this day. Capitalism is on the rocks. We just had our city council person telling us, even with a regional lockdown, that we should go to her favorite restaurant and order a meal.
Even takeout. To take out your Christmas meal.
I'm just saying.
Go to your. Who's making those foods? Who's making that food?
I'm just saying that.
Right. They're not staying home.
We have our elected leaders telling us to keep engaging in consumerism.
Right.
Now the reason they're doing that is because everybody now understands that this arrangement we've had of you work, you get a paycheck, you buy something. They have money, they hire their workers, they work, they get a paycheck, they go buy things. This circle of constant churn of labor, money, consumption, more labor, more money, more consumption, this constant churn was nothing but an agreement. And so long as there was nothing to interrupt any part of that chain, we could go forward that way. But as soon as the pandemic came along and made people want to stay home, have to stay home, need to stay home.
We had no plan B.
There is no plan B for that virtuous circle of consumerism and capitalism. Okay, there's no plan B. That is the plan. We got rid of the original plan of a century ago.
Living on the land and taking care of
that plan.
That's gone. We're all in the
plan
city,
of doing for yourself.
crowded
That's
together.
gone. Okay,
Right. Yeah.
we learned now the hard way that this new plan, this new way, this circle, this tight, fast hamster wheel circle
of capitalism,
of capitalism and consumerism twined like this, okay, was vulnerable.
Right.
And now we've got our elected representatives who are basically owned by businesses running around saying, oh, be sure to go shopping for Christmas, be sure to travel, be sure to fly, be sure to do all these things. And meanwhile,
they're not shutting it down.
Meanwhile, the health department is telling people, don't fly, don't drive, don't go shopping, and if you think there's a mixed message, yeah, there is totally a mixed message, all right? Now, extrapolate that out beyond just the momentary in the larger scheme inconveniences of a pandemic, the momentary inconveniences of a pandemic, where actually everyone is well behaved for the most part, except in Florida and the East Coast, Southeast, where people are kind of pinheads anyway, where they shoot people for wearing a mask. Except for those people, the DNA degenerates, the rest of us are pretty well behaved during all this, and still. It's been a real problem. We've barely been able to cope, and capitalism is on the rocks. Seriously, it could go down and not come back at this point. Wait until climate change starts hitting developing nations and equatorial regions with heat that's unbearable. We've already been seeing some of that in Southern California, right here in the lower 48, right here in Southern California. We've been seeing some of that. Hottest temperature ever accurately recorded on Earth was in Death Valley, just stone's throw from one of the biggest metropolitan regions of the planet. Okay, so it's coming. It's coming, folks. Man, you better get your head out of your ass because it's coming. All right, start paying attention. So, but when that hits, it's not going to be just a little thing that it's an inconvenience like this pandemic. It's going to be a massive disruption.
Right.
When
And
it's 130 degrees
right.
in LA for 10 days at a time,
right.
several times a summer,
Yeah.
and the power fails on the third day of the 10, it's going to be bad.
And fires and flooding and
Now,
all this. So maybe
if we have had
yeah.
nuclear power plants set
Right.
up all over the country by then, by the time this starts,
Yes.
then those people who live in LA and worked at the power plant, as probably they already are situations like that. Where's Diablo Canyon? That's a power plant. That's a nuclear power plant. There's probably others. I don't even know about them. This isn't my industry. I don't pay much attention. They're not going to be going to those places. They're just not going to be doing that. They're going to go home,
running from
pack
fire.
their bags, and they're going to go to Connecticut, where someone's parents are. They're going to go to, North Dakota, get as far away from this as they possibly can, and no one's going to show up for work. And maybe if they did the right thing before they all left and fled, well, then they shut the place down. And maybe they left 3 guys there to keep the pumps working, keep the electricity on, and make sure the emergency generators come on when the power fails. Okay? And maybe those 3 guys do that for a little while, and then something scary happens and a valve breaks or a pump starts working, and they leave. They say, oh, shit, this is done. This shit's done. I'm out of here. I don't want to be within 600 miles of here.
600 miles.
I'm gone. And they're going to leave. And the first time that anybody realizes there's a problem is not because of the media or the workers or the corporation or the government. It's going to be because they're standing out in their backyard, barbecuing. They look up and there's a cloud of smoke. And then it started.
Nuclear meltdown.
You got a nuclear meltdown. And where are the technicians?
And I
thought I heard they shut it down.
Okay, another reason we're going to go extinct. I mean, there it is. There it is again. I mean, that's another really dangerous thing that we're playing with.
Yeah, this is dangerous.
Yeah,
these are dangerous things.
Yeah, and
these are dangerous things. And if there are other ways to build these plants, I'm not aware of them. Apparently, nobody else is either because we're not doing it. These are dangerous things.
Right.
And these fuels are dangerous. These nuclear fuels are dangerous.
Right.
These plants are dangerous. They're blowing up all the time. And I don't care that it's the safest way to generate electricity. More people have died in car accidents.
No CO2.
People have died in airplane accidents, and we don't stop airplanes. Why should we stop nuclear? Fewer people have ever died in a nuclear accident and blah, blah, blah. Well, the problem is that the opportunities for
disaster,
for cataclysms is obvious.
Okay, so let's just finish this because I go shopping at my little farmer's market on my bicycle with my husband, with his rack, his bicycle. Simple. That's the word of the day, is simplify, because complexity is the end of the empire.
Okay, I got this for
and
you.
also, what's the other word? Is extension, or what was the other word
If
you called?
everybody takes your advice
Yeah.
and simplifies,
Yeah.
our civilization ends tomorrow morning.
Right, because of capitalism,
Yep.
right. Civilization ends. Well, COVID-19 has been doing it, so that's what's happening.
Okay,
We have to have
but-
Plan B.
But the
You know?
lockdowns and everything else was all recommendations.
Okay,
Nothing.
But we need
Nobody
Plan
was
B.
required to stop.
okay. So
But
anyway,
if everybody takes your advice
yeah,
and everybody stops,
right,
they stop driving, flying,
yeah,
ordering goods,
Yeah,
they go to the
right.
farmer's market and they grow their own food, then this industrialized civilization ends overnight.
good. Do I have any problems with that?
I'm just telling you.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
That's good. I'm glad. And the thing is that's going to be the end anyway. What did Kat say
Most
about the
likely.
Roman Empire? Is overextension? Was that the word you used? What was the other
Mhm.
word you used? Overextension. Overextended. Okay, so
to the breaking point.
to the breaking point, and that's where we're going. We are going, and this was
We're
a
on it.
very good.
We are already there.
Okay, good. We're already
We're
there.
not going there.
Yeah.
We are now overextended.
Right, we are already overextended. Okay, there
Just
it
gonna
is.
break it anytime.
Amen. Simplify. Have a good day. Fossil fuel free day as much as you can.
No, we'll see about that.